Hello, everyone. I am Zhao Chuan. Let's talk about Saabard the Edmontosaurus. Edmontosaurus is a quite famous hadrosaurid, and one of the best understood members among the group. Extensive fossils of this genus have been discovered, so when mentioning the hadrosaurids, the general image that comes to our mind is all information obtained from Edmontosaurus. It has become a byword for hadrosaurids. On the contrary, the genus Hadrosaurus is less familiar. Numerous Edmontosaurus fossils have been unearthed in remarkably intact condition, and most of them are skeleton fossils, which also contain a lot of mummified specimens. This enables us to well understand the skin and other details of this dinosaur's body, so as to reconstruct it perfectly. Let's first take a look at its skeletal structure. From this 1:35 Edmontosaurus model, you can imagine its entire size. Its body was pretty huge. Some large Edmontosaurus specimens even exceeded the size of Tyrannosaurus rex, with a body length of more than 13 meters. It had several features. First, its head looked slender. Looking at it from above, you can see that the front of its mouth becomes very wide. Then, its body was stout, with a high bulge on its back, like a hunchback. The fossils display that its neck is relatively flexible in an S shape. In the early years, scientists speculated that this animal might be like a horse, with many muscles wrapped around its neck, so its neck would be very robust. This has also been confirmed in new specimens discovered in recent years. It had a typical body plan of hadrosaurids. Its forelimbs were relatively short, and its hind limbs were longer, which led some earlier studies to believe it was a bipedal animal. Some early restorations of hadrosaurids, including Edmontosaurus, also illustrated them standing upright with their tails supported on the ground like a kangaroo. Later, a large number of footprint fossils and in-depth studies of its skeleton concluded that it rarely stood up like that and walked on all fours in most cases. Extensive footprint fossils have proved that it walked on all fours. Its tail was almost as long as the front half of its body. When viewed from the side, its tail was tall. The above neural spines and the underneath hemal arches were all very long, making the tail look relatively flat-sided. If in a cross-section, you can see that its tail is very flat. Because of this, some early studies believed that hadrosaurids were good at swimming and would paddle their tails left and right to move forward. This statement is quite outdated and has been proven to be wrong. Hadrosaurids were not good at swimming. Many sources contributed to the early statement that hadrosaurids could swim. Due to limited materials at the time, or the influence of other dinosaur studies, many early claims tended to the possibility that Edmontosaurus was an animal that could swim. In some early restorations, such as those created by Charles Robert Knight, you can see many scenes of Edmontosaurus swimming in the water or standing on the shore. But we now believe it was an animal that often walked in dry environments, especially plains. Now, let's look at its features part by part. The head of Edmontosaurus was long and narrow. A large number of Edmontosaurus skull specimens have been unearthed. Although each individual has subtle differences, most display a slender face. Even if some specimens are shorter, that may indicate individual or age differences. Generally speaking, the head of an adult Edmontosaurus was relatively long. Its mouth extended forward, with the front part bulging outward. Looking from the skull, the anterior is a flat, duck-like bill. From the preserved keratin fossils, we know that its beak was not flat during life but curved downward. These intact specimens show that the beak has many longitudinal grooves on its surface, a kind of comb tooth-like raised structure, making the bill of this dinosaur present a look as shown in this model. It had many longitudinal textures, which may have served as teeth when it ate the food. It had no teeth in this part, and the textures on its beak might assist in scraping or grabbing food. This structure also makes its restoration look quite different from the skull. Its mouth was curved downward, resembling an inverted bowl or a horse's hoof. When it closed its mouth, the mandible beak would fit inside the upper jaw, just like what this model displays. Then, let's look at its mouth opening. Some early restorations of ornithopod dinosaurs often reconstructed them with cheeks. At the time, due to the insufficient evidence, we speculated that they might have thicker cheeks to accommodate food like today's horses or cows. After all, herbivorous animals generally have cheeks to keep the food. However, in recent years, new muscle studies on the head of this dinosaur have concluded that it had no cheeks. Its muscles remarkably differentiated from those speculated in past reconstructions. They may have stretched backward along the groove in front of the lower jaw and into the temporal fenestra behind its eyes, so there is no cheek. We adopted such a restoration method to make its mouth opening larger and look more like the modern lizard. This is a major difference from the previous restoration. It had two very long openings atop its snout. Many hadrosaurid skulls have large nostrils, but when alive, the nostril openings were possibly located very forward, which allowed this structure to have soft skin and gave it a large nasal cavity to better process the air. Some scholars believe this area will have extraordinarily soft and elastic skin, enabling its nose to be inflated to chirp loudly like a frog. However, we did not adopt such a restoration for this model. This is because most of this dinosaur's skin may have been covered with scales, and scaly skin generally has limited elasticity. The same goes for the cheeks. This point was not taken into consideration when it was restored with cheeks in the early years. If its skin had scales, it might not be so malleable. Current research also supports this view. Its skin would not form highly stretchable cheeks. Similarly, we believe the skin on its nose should still be like this, which only plays the simple role of processing air and enlarging the nasal cavity. However, the color here might be distinguished from other body parts when alive. So, in this model, we made this part a brighter color in contrast to the body. Its eyes were quite small. In some past restorations, the eyes were often restored to be larger than they look now. But we now know that there was a sclerotic ring in dinosaurs' eyes. In the past, the sclerotic ring was thought to be inside the eyeball. Now, we know that it is on the surface of the eyeball, with the pupil exposed in the middle. The inner diameter of the sclerotic ring is the actual size of its eyes, which is what this model shows. This makes this dinosaur's eyes extremely small. Its ears are simple ear holes at the posterior of the skull. There has been controversy about the location of this dinosaur's ears as there is no direct evidence. Some restorations put it in the temporal fenestra. However, considering that the temporal fenestra should have accommodated many muscles, we still put it behind the head, in the hollow area between the neck muscles and the skull. Then, let's take a look at its neck and crest. Direct evidence from Edmontosaurus fossils suggests that it was a flat-headed hadrosaurid, which has long been thought to have had no crest. But in recent years, a very rare specimen, a fossilized impression preserved by an Edmontosaurus on the ground after it died, has shown extraordinary evidence. First, numerous large bumps, tubercles, were found on the neck of this specimen. Rows of large, cracked structures similar to crocodile skin formed an armor-like structure. These large scutes still had small scales on them. Each armor is a large scute composed of many tiny scales, which is a very complex structure. At first, they were thought to be arranged irregularly, but later, more and more prominent evidence showed that they were distributed all the way down in an almost square lattice pattern. These scutes were small at this position, gradually became larger when coming to the lower part of the neck, and then extended backward to the shoulders. Such a large area of scutes could protect its neck, which answered a lingering question for us. When we restored this dinosaur previously, we often thought that animals like the hadrosaurids had no protection on their bodies, and that their necks were vulnerable to getting hurt. Is there some defensive mechanism that can provide protection? The later fossils answered the question. This once again proves the fierce evolutionary competition among species in the age of dinosaurs. What's more surprising is that these impression specimens also show an amazing feature, there was a fleshy, comb-shaped crest atop the Edmontosaurus head. Many restorations restored this crest into a perfect circle. However, when we restored this model, we respected the original state of the fossilized impression and restored it with an irregular shape, a fleshy crest full of wrinkles. Since it was a fleshy crest, we thought it should have relatively thin skin and abundant blood vessels inside, and may present a blood-red color, similar to what this model shows. Edmontosaurus had a very stout body. The neural spines on its back were very tall and stiff. We say its back was relatively stiff because there were many ossified tendons on the neural spines on its back, which interlocked its back firmly. This resulted that, when the dinosaur twisted its body, even though these ossified tendons could slide slightly on the muscles, they partly limited the twisting of the body and acted as a reinforcement. If you look at this model from the top, its back is basically a straight line in normal walking, and it can't move left and right widely. In past reconstructions, these tall neural spines were restored into a dorsal sail, but now we generally think their lateral sides accommodated muscles. When viewed from the top, the neural spines were relatively enlarged at their ends, and had slight grooves on both sides, indicating they were attached to some structures during life. We restored them to be covered with thin muscles on both sides. Based on the anatomical distribution of muscles in modern animals, we can infer that it probably had several relatively long muscles. The longissimus muscle on the back runs through the entire back, forming a relatively shallow muscle. Much evidence has been found about the skin on its trunk as extensive mummified Edmontosaurus have been preserved, so that we can restore the skin of its trunk accurately. One prominent feature of its skin is its texture, which is composed of numerous delicate scales of a few millimeters. Among these scales, especially near the shoulders, relatively large scales were distributed in groups. The larger scales were close to 1 centimeter, and several were grouped. If you look closely at this model, you can see many groups of relatively large scales on it. These were strictly copied from the mummified specimen of Edmontosaurus. These scales were mainly hexagonal, arranged irregularly randomly. Acclaim believes that the size differences of these scales may represent different colors when this dinosaur was alive. For example, on some modern-day lizards, the larger scales are in one color, and the other small ones may be in another color. But this is just a claim, and there are counterexamples. Many other lizards have large and small scales, but their colors are the same. When we designed the coloration of this model, we made this pattern on its body. The white areas are where the large scales are, and the dark areas are where the small ones are. This is the basic theory presented by the patterns on the Edmontosaurus. The scapulae of hadrosaurids like Edmontosaurus were lower than those of early iguanodonts, and they were likely to be more slender and lighter. But when alive, its scapulae were wrapped in muscles. Early restorations often emphasized the scapulae. Looking at some early reconstructed statues or paintings, you can always see the prominent scapulae. Nowadays, the scapulae are often restored to be wrapped. As for a healthy animal, it should be challenging to see the bulging scapulae. Its forelimbs are also a very important discovery in recent years. On a very famous mummified Edmontosaurus specimen, we have seen what its complete forelimbs look like. Based on the skeletal structure, we know that its forelimbs had shorter upper arms and longer forearms. The early restorations always shaped the forelimbs into a very slender appearance. Based on mummified evidence, we now know that although the bones of this dinosaur's forelimbs appear thin, they are actually pretty stout. Extensive detail is perfectly preserved on the forelimbs, including the folds behind the elbows, just as the model looks. Different from the annular folds we previously speculated, they are rows of folds layered one on top of another. A large number of large hexagonal scales can be seen on its forearms. The scales on its body were relatively small, but those on its forearms were very large and thick. Another significant discovery in recent years is that its forelimb ended in hoof-like hands. On some early, poorly preserved mummified specimens, we can see this dinosaur had its thumb degenerated and only had these 4 fingers. One smaller finger was separated, and the other 3 fingers united into a hoof. But no traces of fingernails were preserved on early mummies. Considering that these 3 fingers were wrapped in a fleshy covering, the earliest studies believed they were webbed, resembling a frog's feet, used for swimming. This is why hadrosaurids were thought to be dinosaurs that were good at swimming at the time. It was later proven to be a united hoof-like structure. Due to the absent preservation of nails, it was initially believed to be a fleshy hoof. Looking at the hadrosaurid restorations in the 1980s and 1990s, you can always see their 4 limbs ending in a purely fleshy hoof without any keratinous structure. When I saw these restorations, I was baffled and thought it was strange that such a frequently moved and rubbed part had no armor protection. But in the face of the evidence, we made the same restorations at the time. Later, after the mummified specimen was unearthed, it was discovered that a hoof-like structure indeed existed at the front end. Among the 3 fingers, these 2 fused into a large hoof, and there was another small one. Its little finger was first thought to be long because its phalanges were long. It was initially thought to be used to grab and deliver food into its mouth. However, the later discovered mummified specimen displays a different case. Only the first knuckle was exposed, and the rest were wrapped in thick flesh. So now we know that its forelimbs had a relatively large hoof with thick flesh, and the entire forearm was very stout, which also reasonably explains the locomotion of this dinosaur walking on all 4s. Its pelvis was relatively long and narrow, and its hind limbs were relatively robust. The digits of its feet had degenerated and become very small, and each phalanx was very short, so its feet were like a fleshy ball. There were hoof-shaped toenails at the end of the feet. It should have 5 toes initially, but the ones on both sides have degenerated, leaving only 3. According to the numerous footprints of hadrosaurids, it had 4 pads under its feet, one under each toe and another at the center of its sole. As it stepped on the ground, its footprints looked like a plum blossom, quite lovely. The abdomen of Edmontosaurus had many folds. Its abdominal scales were basically hexagonal with a large number of folds. Relatively clear fossil evidence displays the appearance of this area of its abdomen. This type of dinosaur had a layer of skin between the thighs and the torso, so the range of movement of its thighs was very limited. It could only kick forward limitedly but kick backward more freely. This area had a lot of folds and very delicate scales. Then, let's look at its tail. Its hemal arches were located about here. According to the mummified evidence, its lower part had thick soft tissue, which may contain fat, making its tail in life look much larger than the skeleton. The bottom part also held a lot of fat. Edmontosaurus' tail also had many well-preserved skin impressions, showing that the scales here were larger than those on its body. In addition, there were many transverse raised folds on the sides of its tail, as shown in this model, a bit like those horizontal wrinkles commonly seen on elephants caused by pulling. On the roots of its thighs were a large number of vertical wrinkles. Extensive folds can be found on the base of its tail. Now, we don't think its tail was used for swimming. The top of its tail was tied together by bony rods, making it inflexible and stiff. It mainly played a role in keeping balance. Although this dinosaur walked on all 4s in most cases, it would only use its 2 hind legs when running. It did not run on 4 limbs like mammals, as often shown in many restorations or film and television works. Most dinosaurs cannot run on 4 limbs. We often describe them as moving up and down because their spines are not flexible enough, and they can only use their limb joints for movement. Many square structures, which can be called blunt spikes, can be seen on the back of Edmontosaurus. Like today's iguanas, its back had such a row of ornaments. Mummified specimens and extensive skin impressions all display this structure. This model summarizes years of research on the growth patterns of this part of Edmontosaurus skin. The spikes near the front were smaller, and those in this area were very large. Above the pelvis, the spikes were relatively long with sharper tips. In this area at the base of the tail and on the back, you can see that the two spikes are farther apart, but the closer they get to the tail, the closer the spikes are to each other. Some intact Edmontosaurus specimens show those preserved raised structures next to each other with almost no gaps in between, just like how this model presents. As the tail became thinner and thinner, these structures were getting smaller and smaller. Although it is unknown what the end of the tail looked like, we restored it like this model. Good. The above concludes our introduction to Saabard the Edmontosaurus.